All right, let's get started. So I was looking around for a good sort of overview orientation reading. So last time we read about the Paxos system. That was kind of like a dive off the deep end. Nathan, you weren't here, but I'm assume you're familiar with it. So that was a dive off the deep end. This is more dive off the shallow end, and this was the only thing I could find in the first couple of pages of results that seem to be of this type, which is kind of interesting. It suggests that there's not that much of good material for diving into distributed systems more generally. So just the general comments and one question that you can think of that you don't yet know the answer to, and I'll kick us off and we'll go up from me, so with Nathan, Meredith, and so on. So the one question that occurred to me that I don't yet know the answer to is, how do you add a new member to a distributed system? So either social or computer. The social version is there's a group that's kind of functioning and a new member joins. What's the sort of characteristic distributed systems problem of adding them as a trusted member of the group? And the main reaction I have to this article is I was not actually aware of the SLP impossibility idea that even a single unreliable process makes it impossible to get to consensus in a distributed system. So if some process or person dies suddenly, you don't know whether they just stopped responding or are responding slowly or are dead. So that's kind of interesting to me. Makes it seem extremely hard, the whole area. All right, Nathan, to you.
I think we're just going to have to skip me. I don't have any fully formed thoughts right now, so I'm just going to pass up to Meredith, I think.
Okay, so we're just asking a question that arose in us when we read this, to recap?
Yeah.
Okay. So, as I read this, I kept on thinking about, Unix and Unix tools and, is everything really distributed? And, what are we really talking about? When we're talking about distributed versus, I guess, monolithic. That sort of, I wonder if distributed is not the normal state of affairs. That's a kind of like a meta. That's not very detailed. That's what I kept on thinking about as I read this. I guess I'm gonna go. Let's go to Ben, or we're going down the list.
Oh, we are going up the list. So actually, it's Jenna.
Okay.
Jenna.
Thanks, Meredith. Yeah, I had this reaction about, what system isn't distributed. And I suspect there is a pretty specific definition when you're talking about computer systems, which I think is where our new friend is living. I got partway in before I could even decide that this is really from the computer science world, because, of course, I think, as like you said, this, applying this to human systems is a natural place for us to go. I think that's the. I'll say one more thing. I love that there are people who will take the time to get into the weeds in this way, And so if we're going to do a lexicon, are we going to just grab kind of all of these phrases and populate them over to our lexicon? Because then that would be helpful to somebody who's getting oriented in a space. I'm sure I'll have a couple of other thoughts, but I'll pass it on to Grigori now.
Reading this article, I was thinking about the role of consensus and what are the assumptions behind it. It is not really clear to me why do we need it at all. And it seems that the example I saw in the article relates to systems representing a single unit, like a car, for example, with a lot of sensors, and then you have to reach a consensus to move a car in one certain direction. So there is a certain hierarchy in a system. What if there is no hierarchy? What if we don't need to reach a consensus? So what are the alternatives to, looking for them? Probably there are, in my view. What if we don't have to move in one direction and can move in two different directions? So instead of consensus, we have a divergence. And I will pass it to commits.
So what I enjoyed reading this, keeping in mind the lexicon and the map making exercise that we're working on. I thought that was a really useful frame. I guess it's not really a fully formed question, but I suppose I'm sort of interested in maybe like a couple things, I guess, like what is like the difference between dependencies and a kind of like software dependency sense in a distributed system, or like I guess like another like a general question is like I would love, in addition to like an article like this, I think it'd be in the same way that it's that book about problems with consensus in the auto industry. It'd be interesting to come up with a list of problems that distributed systems attempt to solve or are designed to attempt to solve. Some kind of list like that would be really interesting and kind of grounding this. And then I suppose like maybe a little bit like Grigori, like the kind of like idea of time, like the relationship between consensus and time is kind of interesting. There was a video that I was watching of a kind of AR headset that was set up to where you could have like play backable events in different orders where there were dependencies of the orders of the events that you could play back. It was sort of like email, but for checking back on events that had occurred when you were, ignoring them because you were in this augmented reality context. So, sorry, they're not really questions, but they're just kind of like floating thoughts. I will pass to Ben.
So while reading this, and I'm aware of this because so most of the fundamental ideas here I'm aware of, but it's always interesting to see the language differences between basically the place where I work, where there's more the blockchains versus the more general theoretical distributed systems place. And one thing I guess I would really like to see, and I'm not sure if you could actually do this, so this is I guess my question of what I'm not sure to do, is a way to show these theoretical ideas, unify the language between the different spaces, I guess, used to talk about them, and then talk about like the engineering results that come out of, because every time you have an impossibility result or some kind of other theoretical limit, in practice what you have is you have some trade-off. So obviously, in general, when you find an impossibility result, and this is not just true in system space, basically in all science and engineering, you try to find a way around it. You don't just give up. And it actually manifests as some sort of engineering trade-off. Like the FLP impossibility leads to you trying to build a system like, so you have some kind of fault detection, or you have some way to recover and restore life in case a node suddenly, it permanently dies. And like in the F2 system they're continuing to work on, what you have is the inactivity leak, so that if your node is not present, it starts to slowly bleed out of stake, and eventually it loses so much stake it's booted out of the set. So you have, and this is a particular engineering trade-off, and this doesn't like, it gets around it doesn't disprove the impossibility result. It gets around it another way, and there's trade-offs to this, and it changes the threat model and so on. But it'd be very interesting to look at, like I said, here's this possibility result. Given these case studies, this is how systems actually try to get around it. There's the various trade-offs underlying these engineering sort of things. So that's something I would like to see. Anyway, I'll pass on.
I think Anuraj is in listen-only mode, so Nathan, circling back to you, any thoughts now?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just not a fast thinker. I think actually it's funny. I started thinking about something kind of along the lines of what Ben was talking about, but thinking more about the question of failure. It strikes me as like one of the sort of the base level assumptions in a paper like this is that you want a system that doesn't fail. But I think practically it's maybe more useful to turn it on its head and say system failure is inevitable, so how do you handle recovery? And so the question of recovery from failure, I think, is interesting, and it seems like there's probably multiple axes that you could try to optimize recovery systems on, but two that I think actually are maybe different, even if they maybe sound at first the same, is one is the question of do you recover and you try to maintain maximal system integrity, so you try to keep the system in as much of a working order and as many nodes as possible still part of it, or do you try to recover in a way that optimizes for correctness, where you think that whatever state you recovered to is the state that you should have been in, which may involve throwing away large parts of the system. And so that question of, well, what if we just assume that failure is inevitable and say, how does a distributed system recover from failure, may be an interesting one. I guess back to Venkat.
All right. So I was trying to take notes as we spoke. I don't think that's synchronized yet, but I just wanted to summarize the questions. I captured the main questions, and so mine was, how do you add a new trusted member to a distributed system set? Meredith was, are distributed systems really the norm, and if so, how should we think about that? Jenna, I missed your question, so did you have one? I know you had like a couple of comments. Did you have a specific question you want to add to the list? I want to basically inventory a bunch of questions.
I might turn it into, if we're going to map this stuff to human systems, where does it work, where does it break, kind of thinking.
Okay. I'll have that as your question. All right. Grigory's big question was, why do we even need consensus? Commits had difference between software dependencies versus distributed systems, and that's an interesting one. Just off the top of my head, thought is, there actually isn't one. If you're relying on a library coming from somewhere, you're effectively in like a distributed system that can fail on you. Ben, how do you unify the language? How do you get to engineering trade-offs from this sort of theoretical framework? And by unify the language, I assume, Ben, you mean blockchain-y language and more general distributed systems language, right? Is that what you meant?
Yes, in particular, because that's what I was thinking of, but I'm aware this is actually a very large problem, not just in the distributed system space, but in general, how to get various sub-factions to talk to each other is sort of a fundamental possibility. So, yes, I was thinking in particular of, because I know of so many of these things under slightly different names, and so that's what I was thinking of in particular in this case.
Yeah. I particularly liked your example, which I took a note of inactivity bleed as a solution to the FLP impossibility. And I think we've been talking about that, right? Like, if people have been inactive in the Discord for a while, you kind of like reduce their points or something, and at some point they lose privileges on the server. So there's kind of like a direct analogy to many of these sort of apparently hard-edged engineering problems and solutions, and how you would deal with the human softer versions of the same kinds of problems. And Nathan's question was, how do you think about recovery from failure? Do you solve for maximal system integrity or optimize for correctness and so forth? And I think the overview had a couple of pointers, but didn't have a whole lot to say. All right, so I think that's a good kind of like starting survey of questions we have. Kamit, do you want to take a few minutes to explain what you and Meredith were doing with the Lexicon project and how we can use your experience to segue into what we're trying to do now?
Sure. Yeah, I can try. Maybe Meredith can jump in as well if I'm missing anything. Yeah, I guess in some senses we were trying to think about less so like what a list of terms and their definitions would be, but more how to place them in a technical and socially distributed and decentralized system. So in terms of like actually generating, and I don't think that those like things that we were trying to think about, like how to place them into that system, are really totally applicable here, because that's not really what we're doing. But in terms of actually generating the terms and the definitions, I don't think we really discussed anything along those lines. I think we were imagining that we would draw from, for example, like the list of the terms and definitions from the OGS paper. But I guess in my past experience, when I've done like lexicons, they have been the kind of thing that have just been emergent out of discourse, and then someone is going around and trying to like find those terms and then collate them. But I guess in our case, what we could do is we could just, I was trying to take some notes during the call and also while reading this article, and maybe we can keep an ongoing list of terms that we either ourselves, turns of phrases that we come up with, or kind of turns of phrases in the reading that we're doing that we think we might have of, collate them in a thread or a Rome page, and then periodically have sync ups where we define terms in a group manner and ask each other questions while we're doing it. In the past it's just been like make a full list of terms and then get everyone on a call for an hour, and then everyone's kind of collaboratively, emergently writing the definitions and editing other people's definitions and just making the list of terms. But I don't know, Meredith, is there anything that we did that you think is relevant here that I missed?
Yeah. No, I think that's I think you have a really good description. It's like every community has their own language or uses language in a particular way. And I think that's what we were interested in capturing. and bringing into the community or people that are using the language in similar ways. So that's I feel, but I think commits got everything. So.
All right. So I thought we could do a very quick exercise. We're about half an hour in, but why don't we take about 15 minutes to just collectively go to that page. I think I linked to it, or it's linked off of the main Distributed Systems Study Group page. So the page is called Distributed Systems Map and Lexicon. So just start dumping terms that are on your mind that have come from today's reading or last week's reading, and whether it's social or technical. For like 15 minutes, just write down terms, and if you have like an initial definition in mind, you can just put it in, or if you have a reference that comes readily to mind, just throw in the reference for the term. But if not, just put it in. So 15 minutes. Everybody have the link? I can post it again.
Can you post it again? I don't think I have it.
Yeah, like that. Wait, what am I doing? All right, it's in voice meta. So just go to that link and start dumping in terms under the lexicon larger bullet. If you want, you can make like a name bullet for yourself and start typing under your sublist, and we can sort of merge them later if you don't want like things jumping all over. All right, let's take a minute to wrap up whatever terms are still on your mind, and then take some time to reflect on this exercise. 1 more minute. All right, let's bring it back in, and let's do a quick round of comments on the exercise, and maybe we can start with Ben this time and go down.
All right, yeah. So what I tried to do was try to go through and try to remember and look up some of the terms I'm more aware of from the blockchain space and put them here so that they can eventually be compared, hopefully, to more distributed system terms. I suspect a lot of them all have different names, and there's probably not that many that are new. So I'm trying to get the ones I have down here. As for this exercise, I did like the idea. I think it's useful. So moving on, I guess.
Comments?
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize I was unmuted. So I don't know exactly what we're doing, but I came up with some terms and tried to define or sketch out the sentiment of some of them. Maybe I can just go down the line. Inactivity leak, based around what Ben and Venkat were talking about earlier. Something to do with gossip, sort of based off of the secure scuttlebutt protocol. Something to do with logical clocks as the base concept. I have a feeling we could come up with a term that kind of captures the breadth of these types of clocks. Honeybee democracy and other ethological representations of collective decision making, sort of as a subcategory of leader elections. Frictionless optimism, or some kind of term to point towards the tendency towards optimistic programming and governance. There was a little bit of a discussion around that at a couple points when we were doing the blockchain governance track, and maybe what the relationship there is with failure modes. Commits vortex for being drawn into a series of I think Rafa was once talking about how once you start making on-chain transactions or commitments, it's sort of like the Facebook adage of just once you start posting, you kind of don't want to stop. Something along those lines, or something around transactional attention economies. On-chain, fuck around and find out. Bottlenecking, which is sort of a play on rubbernecking, but distributed systems that are designed to propagate failure. Dependency governance, and apparent consensus, which there was a paper that was linked at the blockchain channel that seems connected to this. I think Grigori's next.
Yep, it took some time to fumble around the Discord. It was an interesting exercise. In my experience, every time we are, or any group starting defining the terms, the list of the terms becomes unmanageable somewhat. So it's a known problem, at least for me it's a known problem. So I was thinking about alternative ways of working with lexicons. And one of these ways don't focus on terms, but instead focus on models. And in my list, there are plenty of models as opposed to terms. And model is a concept, basically. Another alternative, in my view, is ask yourself why this particular term was first introduced. What was the need for it? If you see a term in an article or somewhere, ask yourself what was the need for it. And then ask yourself again whether it's in your case, whether you need it. Or your particular group needs the same term. So probably my general answer to this proliferation of terms problem is to try to cut down them earlier. And the next person is Jenna.
Yeah, with respect to Grigori's point about the burden of a lexicon, I spent a whole lot of my first 30 years studying foreign languages, and so there is definitely a cost to internalizing all these phrases. On the other hand, I think it's pretty cool that I keep coming back to shelling points and gravity wells, just fun ideas that keep pinging around for me. And so each of these phrases that will end up in our lexicon becomes a container for a whole bunch of stuff, and then therefore it could be a useful shorthand. So for my own contributions, I just tried to be a dutiful student and went through the Videla piece and grabbed every phrase that seemed like a phrase that would be a good candidate for us. Over to you, Nathan.
Okay. I was just trying to pull some terms around, failure out of the paper, and kind of just think of some, what would be almost like keywords for places where there feels like a little bit of holes there. So, like under failure detection, the paper talks about two kinds, but it feels like there's got to be other failure detections. And, in terms of failure modes, the first thing that popped out, one of the things that jumped out at me was like, if you're talking about failure detectors, there's the whole question of the failure detectors, who watches the watchers in the distributed system. It feels like there's definitely some additional depth, and I was just mostly trying to, come up with sort of keywords of what might be filled in by like an actual term that somebody has used as opposed to something I just made up. And I tried to mark all those with question marks so it's obvious when I'm just speaking off the cuff. Something that occurred to me actually as Grigori and Jenna were speaking is it almost feels like, I'm not sure what we're thinking about because I missed a few meetings, the final output of this would look like. But it feels like a lexicon, or at least the way we're thinking about it, is maybe even more suited to like a graph-like arrangement than just a list of terms. And I think the art of Rome graph is maybe a little overloaded. So I would be kind of tempted to start this in a new graph, but I wonder if it would make sense to be like one page, one term, and then try to link them together to create kind of a web of terms that somebody could explore. And that might be may not be more useful, but a more realistic way of showing the interrelations. I don't think Rome has the ability, I know people were talking about this, but the ability to alias pages, which would be really helpful, but I'm not sure of any alternative that does have that ability. So that was just something that as we were doing this, and then as Grigori and Jenna were speaking, I was like, oh, this feels like we're almost like making like, not Wikipedia, but a Wiktionary, like just a wiki of very short pages that are definitions. And then I think that would be handing it to Venkat. Yes, Venkat.
All right, yeah. This was, I think, a useful starter exercise. I think we're still in the unknown phase of our discovery process, I guess. So last time, if you recall, those of you who weren't there, this might be UGC, but yeah, we were doing kind of similar exercise of if we were to draw a conceptual map of distributed systems, so kind of like an allegorical map with like, mountains of blockchain and planes of consistency, kind of like terms to it. What would the main continents or like geographic divides be? And I think that gave us a different useful macro perspective. I agree with Grigori that this sort of exercise can sort of immediately proliferate huge numbers of terms. Models is one way to try and like corral and like create some order in them. And I think this is the approach Kate Krutler took with her 8 qualities of DAOs that we read in the last cycle. So that kind of gives you like 8 gestalt ways of looking at the whole thing. The one I'm thinking of as an alternate way to do this, and maybe it's not alternate, but we can do both. We did this for the online governance primer, which is you want to make this a very opinionated list. So you don't want an objective commodity lexicon that sort of represents something like a dictionary. Instead, you want something like, I'm just making one up, but something like, the Hacker's Guide to Distributed Systems. That would put a very particular perspective on it. You would think about distributed systems like a hacker, and every definition you write and every term you include would have some aspect of like how do you hack into the system. So here I mean like malicious hacking. So that's one way to do it. Like find a very strong opinionated perspective as the unifying theme and use that as a way to filter what you include versus exclude, and also lend a particular tone to all the definitions you put in. So I'd like us to think about that. So next week, I suggest we skip next week's meeting since a lot of people are in the US and it's the 4th of July and a lot of people will be out. But the week after that, so we have 2 weeks, think about sort of what the opinionated angle for us would be, as well as Grigori's direction of what are some overarching models. And maybe you can break out the models and opinionated perspectives as a separate list as opposed to inside the lexicon, and use that as like larger organizing framework for both the lexicon and the map. Maybe the models and perspectives help you structure the map as well as the lexicon. So take time to think about that. And to Nathan's point of like, can we do a new graph? We could always spin up a new graph. Now there's no limit on the number of graphs in an account, so I can do that if people are interested. But I will push back a little bit. I find thinking in graphs useful when I'm brainstorming and like putting down like a set of material. But when I'm like trying to read or get introduced to a new topic, I actually strongly prefer serial or linear presentation. Like I like and appreciate having like a 2-dimensional structure, like a graph or map as a reference point just to get the big orientation. But I actually like having like, 100 top things to know about distributed systems, or like 20 references you must read, that kind of thing where you can like just start in the beginning and end at the end. And by the end, you've kind of like done an exhaustive kind of guided tour, and you kind of have a sense of like where you are. So if we do something like a graph, I would still like kind of a guided tour through the graph. So maybe alphabetical ordering is the wrong way to like present such information, and instead you should kind of like do a guided walking tour through a more conceptually linked space. So we can think about options like that. But yeah, just another opinion on the table. All right, 1 minute left. Any closing thoughts?
Just a practical comment about the separate graph, realm graph. I've tried that before. In fact, with a different lexicon exercise where I was working with a book that had a bunch of terms and definitions, and there's actually a nice way of ordering it. I can share a link to that. But it doesn't work. Like Rome is not the graph, like the chart graphing function it just isn't good for anything, honestly. So even if you have it all separated into its own setup, you still want to use a different graphing tool. So it's a nice idea, and I went through the whole process of doing it. I can just tell you from experience that it doesn't work.
Fair enough. It was just a random idea.
All right. So, yeah. Oh, also there's a bunch of like open slots. So if there's a session you'd like to read or a discussion you'd like to have, please pick a date and just slot yourself in. There's, I think, like 10 sessions left in this summer cycle. So yeah, I'm just like throwing in readings and thinking up shallow exercises for the first couple. But yeah, we'll go back to the format of like, if you have a distributed systems topic, both technological or social or cultural, just pick a date and lead a discussion. All right, see you guys in 2 weeks.